So somebody just brought into class after break a big honking piece of pepperoni cheese with onions pizza, and it's smelling up the whole classroom. So those of you at home,
You want a cookie?
you can, yeah. Yeah, right. You can just pass that around the room as your punishment. Yeah. All right, well, you at home need to cook yourself a pizza to get the same effect. All right, we're in the home stretch. Let's turn to Chronicles. And I have to admit, in my preparation, growing up and in my MDiv and even into my PhD, I didn't have a lot of chance to, flap my scholarly wings studying the book of Chronicles, but I've gotten a lot more into Chronicles as I've done class prep for the teaching of the class Old Testament Survey 2, and I've really benefited from it. So hopefully what I share with you might be a leaping off point for any of you that want to go on and study the book of Chronicles a little bit more. It's one of those, I call it hidden gems in the 39 books of the Old Testament. Oftentimes gets overlooked and not read. Why? Well, you've got Samuel and Kings. You've read that. Why do you have to read another history book that, covers a lot of the same material? It's just a retelling of what was already said. Really? Well, I'm going to try to emphasize a justification for saying no to that and reading Chronicles on its own terms. Because as we've said, we've got the author of Chronicles he's not like the author of Kings, who's writing, I argue, to the exiles, making the case of here's a historical reminder and explanation for why you're in exile. Guess what the author of Chronicles is going to do? He's writing to the group that's come out of exile. Remember? And the author of Chronicles is addressing that group. And guess what his main objective is? I'm going to call it here in a little bit, eschatological encouragement and hope for the future. He's giving them encouragement for what God's yet to do and what God's going to do. So that's a huge, huge difference. And we're going to see that eschatological encouragement approach, or you might say the thesis, show up in how the book of Chronicles is different than the books Samuel Kings. Even though it's so-called covers the same material in history, it does, but it's slightly different in terms of what its focus. So you already know the very last word of the author of the book of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 36. It's that you'll hear me say this like a squeaky wheel, let him go up, let him go up. And there's that eschatological encouragement in the very last word of the author of Chronicles. And if we turn, we've done this before, but the very last word of our New Testament canon, the book of Revelation, and I'm having a hard time turning there, we've got our let him go up encouragement. So he says, John, if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part from the tree of life and from the holy city, which are written in this book. He who testifies these words says, quote, quoting the Lord, yes, I'm coming quickly. And the response is, our response, amen. Come, Lord Jesus, come. The grace of the Lord Jesus be with us all, amen. So there's commonality there. So this commonality, again focuses on the King of Kings who's coming. From our vantage point, we're looking down the road and seeing the same future focal point that the author of Chronicles was looking to. Jesus is coming, and I think in the case of Chronicles, coming again. There's things that are yet to happen that haven't happened yet. So there's this eschatological anticipation, which I think becomes somewhat of the interpretive key that we can use through the entire 1st and 2nd Chronicles corpus. And that's kind of what my focus is, again, that we're going to see as we kind of look at it and break it down. So he is coming. So this let him go up where? Where do I go? We will see. It's Zion. It's the new restored Jerusalem. It's the place where the king is going to come, from the line of King David. When he comes, he's going to sit and rule and establish his kingdom and extend life and blessing to the whole world. The nations of the world will participate and benefit from this. So we're going to see where this goes. That's the last word of the author. That's the last word of the author of Chronicles, who I don't know if he knew or not, but it was his last word of the Hebrew canon, and it was his last word of encouragement to the faithful remnant, wherever they might be in history after that point. So, by the way, we're part of the faithful remnant. We're encouraged to read the last word of encouragement, let him go up or let her go up, and understand what all that means. We need to be encouraging our people with this message of eschatological anticipation for what God is still yet to do, and it still has on his agenda for us. So if you look at the book, broad stroke, there's 3 big sections, and now I'm looking at Chronicles as a single unit, as a single book. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles, let's just evaporate the 1 and 2, and just look at Chronicles as a whole. And you see there from the first 9 chapters, we're going to talk about that and its significance. But you have from Adam, and a lot of a genealogical reference to from Adam all the way up to the time period of the Babylonian, from the restoration from Babylon. So all the way up to the time of restoration. So that entire history is all boiled down to this genealogical account, which is really interesting. So we're going to make some theological observations on those first 9 chapters based on this theological agenda that the author has of eschatological encouragement and anticipation. All right? And then we have 1 Chronicles chapter 10 overlapping into 2 Chronicles chapter 9. Front and center, you might say the center of the Big Mac, is David and Solomon. Huge section right there. David and Solomon largely. And then from 2 Chronicles chapter 10 all the way to the end, chapter 36, we have from King Rehoboam all the way to the restoration from Babylon. So again, I think that the author of Chronicles, he's writing to the group of, you might say, the faithful remnant, those who had returned from the Persian captivity because of the Cyrus decree. But I think also he has in view, probably because of some, divine inspiration, this is going to be a lasting word that is extending to the faithful remnant wherever they are in future history. Because the faithful remnant, wherever they are always asking this question: what does God have for us? What does God have in store for us? Has God forgotten on us? Has he forgotten us? And the author of Chronicles is saying emphatically, no. God has a future and a plan for you, faithful remnant. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about these 9 chapters of genealogy. Let's take a look at the very first chapter here. And we're going to cover every jot and tittle, every verse. We're going to read it out loud, all 9 chapters. No, I'm just kidding. Now, we typically read this or just quickly skip over it. I mean, that's not what the author intends for us to do, right? But take a look at where it starts. Where does it start? Very first word, Adam. And if you just flip over, it moves into, chapter 1, verse 1, Adam. So the genealogy of Adam, who happens to be the father of, you might say, humanity. All the people of the world find their roots in him. And then you move into specifics, like the genealogy of Abraham. And not very long in chapter 2, verse 1, notice where it goes next. Everybody see that? These are the sons of Israel. Yeah, we get into the genealogy of the 12 tribes. So Israel is going to see and read and be reminded of her unique national, ethnic distinction as a nation, as a people group, people of God, the Israelites. So here's my overarching thesis. So the author of Chronicles is writing an eschatological encouragement intentionally to the nations of the world, but uniquely to Israel. Everything that he's about to say in terms of his historical recounting is intended to include specifically the nations of the world, finding themselves in the genealogical line of Adam's race, but also specifically and uniquely to Israel. Right there, chapter 2, verse 1. So God's future for Israel, God's future it, for Israel, you might say, involves everybody on the planet. In other words, all the nations of the world are going to benefit eventually because of God's fulfillment of his promise to Israel. All right? And that means, knock on wood, I'm going to get into some theological controversy here, but eventually where I'm going is I'm talking about Israel as an ethnic, national, and involving land, territorial nation, people group. Does that make sense? Ethnic, I'm including all of those things. All right, so 9 chapters from the father of humanity to the 12 tribes with their genealogies. So this invitation to go up, you can use this evangelistically if you want to. It starts with humanity, but it also involves Israel. Everybody's going up to what God has planned for the future. So we talk about Zion, the restored Jerusalem, new heaven, new earth, and God as king sitting on his throne in the line of David and extending the kingdom blessings. All of the life and the blessing that extends to all of the nations are listed here and intentionally listed here in the genealogy of the author, the historian, the theologian, the chronicler that we call him. Now, it's at junctures like this that this guy here, right, being kind of like a very humble biblical theologian, I hear arguments out there in the real world where there are scholars who might take a slightly different interpretation. So here's where I'm putting on my scholarly hat, and now I'm going to jump in here and offer a discussion, a friendly discussion, with other ways of explaining things that I disagree with. So you ready for this? I'm not trying to tip any. And remember my buckets illustration. You know, you've got your opinions bucket, you've got your persuasions bucket, you've got your convictions bucket. Remember the 3 buckets? I'll probably drop this into the middle bucket just because I've done some thinking about it. But here's where it fits into the broader conversation that's out there. There's something that's called replacement theology that you might run into. Replacement theology, yeah, it's out there. Or a more technical term called supersessionism. Did I say that correctly? Supersessionist. Or you could be called a replacement theologian. Or maybe you've read someone who claims to be a replacement theologian. Replacement theology is kind of the bad term. People that are replacement theologians don't typically like to be called replacement theologians because the idea of replacement is oftentimes the point of contention. But let me just lay out the argument here and talk about 2 different ways where some theologians attempt to displace Israel. That's really the focus here, is what's the future for Israel? And there's 2 basic camps of so-called replacement that are out there. The first one would be called ethnic supersessionism, where Israel as a people has been replaced in the divine plan, the future plan, by the Gentile people. So you've got Gentiles replacing Jews. All right? That's called ethnic supersessionism or replacement theology. Israel failed, bad, and God canceled all of his promises made to Israel and turned from them to the Gentiles.
Like an ethnic divorce.
Yep, ethnic divorce, right? And the future church is a Gentile reality only. Sounds kind of harsh. I know we've already seen some head shaking here. You've not heard that from me, obviously, all semester long. But not far away, we might find some folks who might talk more about this, and it would be called more what would be coined as traditional dispensationalism. Holds to a lot of this idea, or this, in other words, the future for Israel is the contention. What is God's future plan for the ethnic, national, territorial Israel? All right, don't start throwing the tomatoes yet. The second one is more of what's called an economic supersessionism. Israel, or quote, the earthly people of the Old Testament has been replaced by the spiritual people. The church, that is the church of the New Testament. So now it's the church that replaces the ethnic, national, territorial people of the Old Testament. Israel was never in God's mind more than just a temporary reality. You might think of it as a leaping point to get us to the New Testament church. All right, and then finally, the Old Testament promises are all interpreted what would be called with a kind of a spiritual hermeneutic, I call it. It's been called various places in order to get at their true meaning. So the Old Testament promises specific to Israel as an ethnic, national, territorial Israel are interpreted spiritually as all fulfilled in Christ. Now, I don't disagree with that either. I just have a slightly different way of getting to that finish line that's a little differently. And the way I get to the finish line does not exclude Israel as an ethnic, national, territorial entity. Not to mention Israel as unique and distinct with other nations who maintain their ethnic, national, but not necessarily territorial distinction and uniqueness. So here's my problem, the biblical hermeneutic. So this gets into interpretation. And earlier I said, so this on the right would be more what would be, now they don't like it, but you get more of that kind of approach in what's called covenantal theology, or the covenantal theologians might get a little bit more into that camp on the right. So there's a lot of debate right now going on, and some of the people I work with, especially my boss, is into what's called progressive dispensationalism. So the progressive dispensational will not completely line up with what's called traditional dispensational on the very point of the future for Israel. Progressive dispensational will take the covenant promises seriously as directed to a ethnic, national, territorial Israel with full intention of fulfillment in the future. And the future in Christ, but not to the dissolving of the ethnic, national, territorial distinctions. So it gets a little complicated, but I just wanted to throw it out for you rocket scientists in the room. You might be having conversations and discussions, or you might be wrestling with this in and of your own reading, and you come across this. This just helps you to understand it a little bit. Now, let me get to the end of this, and I'll answer your question. So my biblical hermeneutic, in terms of trying to be a biblical theologian, a biblical scholar, a biblical hermeneutic is to try to allow all of the text to speak on its own terms without overlaying something else or some kind of interpretive lens. So when I come to passages like 1 Chronicles and recognize that there's 9 chapters here of genealogy specific to not only humanity, Adam, and the human race, all of the nations of the world, aka, but also specific references to the tribes, Israel, specific to the names of the tribes, the 12 tribes, all wrapped up as a, hey y'all, reminder, God's got a future for you. It's hard for me to just spiritualize that. Now what I mean is, what I want to do and what I'm inclined to do is talk about that. Well, how's that going to be fulfilled? What is God up to in the future? Well, it's going to come back to, eventually, when Jesus comes back and accomplishes all of the things on his to-do list, guess who's going to show up arm in arm with the nations of the world? Israel. To their land, territorial, ethnically, and as a nation. I think just like all the other nations. So to make a long story short, we could go to Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 8 through 20, which I think is another context or another text where we see this idea embedded in concrete. You can go there. We won't go there, but it's that passage that talks about arm in arm. The reference to Israel, the reference to the nations, but this great text, arm, shoulder to shoulder. It's this idea of shoulder to shoulder. Here's the idea that I have that you can write down. The difference between this column on the right, they would talk more about, and it's a subtle thing. It's not an issue. I don't think, you got to be friendly when you talk about this. Instead of a future, here's the subtle difference, a future kingdom, instead I would hold to a future, when Jesus comes back to rule as king, he's coming as the King of Kings. So a kingdom of kingdoms. So with, Israel as one, but with a unique job description in that future, but with you've got the nations also included. And both, what this gets into is, where are they going? Well, there's land involved, and sometimes we get into a picture where we see so much of this kind of thing. I call it the homogenization of heaven, where everybody looks the same. Jesus is obviously coming back to rule and establish his kingdom, but so many people in our churches see this idea in this picture. Instead, I like this picture. You see the nations intact and remaining. Jesus is still ruling as king, but it's a kingdom of kingdoms. So you've got the nations maintaining their ethnicity and their uniqueness, and some of that is incorporated into it. Seems as if all of the promises, especially in the prophetic texts, we talk a lot about this in OT3. I'll be teaching that again this fall if you're interested. But okay, questions. Here we go. I'm putting on my Teflon coat here.
I was going to ask, is there anybody that believes that there will be a remnant of Israel that will come back, and only a remnant? Because I've only kind of heard either all or nothing.
I think we're talking about the faithful remnant.
Yeah.
Yeah, by faith in the Messiah. Mm-hmm.
I feel like a lot of people kind of just throw out this idea that all of Israel is going to be redeemed because of the promise, because of the covenant that they have with God. But I kind of feel even in the Old Testament, even though the covenant was always intact, mm-hmm. there's always a large portion of Israel that gets
unbelievers.
Yeah.
Yeah, we covered that earlier this semester. The faithful remnant.
Yeah. I
think the promises are intended for the faithful remnant who of any time in history, but then certainly for any faithful remnant who are around. I think part of the activity of the conflict when Jesus comes back, and even right before to the time that Jesus comes back, there's going to be some of the fire gets turned up in a way of getting people's attention, not just the Israelites or to grow the faithful community, but also amongst the nations.
So then you are saying though that there is a faithful remnant now, and those that are or you're saying that the fire will be turned up and maybe more people will be drawn towards that?
I hope so, yeah.
But you don't believe that the rest of the nation, the literal nation of Israel, will be kind of redeemed? Or what happens to everybody else?
Well, I think let's see, am I going against the grain here? The equation for who's in the faithful remnant, aka those who are saved,
right.
It's always I'm entering into the faith community by faith, by grace through faith, right? Did I say that right? And none of that changes regardless of ethnicity or nationality. That's still the requirement. So the faithful remnant, in a kingdom of kingdoms, the faithful remnant is all there and on our membership cards, saved by faith through grace, by grace through faith. But there's still a place for the uniqueness of my nationality, my ethnicity, I think.
I just feel I've heard a lot of people here at Southwestern not directly say, but kind of imply that they believe that all of Israel is going to come back to God, or that they have some sort of place that's higher than what you just stated right now.
There seems to be in some of the Old Testament prophetic texts, the covenants are coming out of the history of Israel with God's people. So the covenants, for example, the Abrahamic covenant, first to Israel, God's people, but then as an extension to the nations, right? So I think there's a slight elevation of Israel in the forward-looking plan, and some of the picture that you see, with regards to land fulfillment. I think there's a focus on effectively back to a land. That's where there's going to be a place on planet Earth, center of gravity, ground zero, where all of this begins. So, I mean, so here we go. Here we go, the controversy. Yeah, okay.
Are there any other places in the New Testament besides Romans 9 that says something specific about this, like about the nation of Israel as an ethnic?
In the New Testament? Well, I'm an Old Testament scholar, so. Hey, that wasn't supposed to be funny. Yeah, I think so. I have to get my wits about me, but I mean, look, I'm just telling you kind of why I am who I am with regards to this topic. I know it's a hot topic out there, a hot button, but I think both groups seem to agree that all points lead to the fullness of what God has promised, extending to God's people, to the faithful. There's just a slight difference on where does Israel end up. And you read your Old Testament and you see, I mean, what we have to do, the work of biblical interpretation extends into the New Testament, obviously. But then we have to, if these Old Testament texts are allowed to speak on their own terms, add it up, what does it mean for how we understand Paul in this book or this letter? How do we understand the author of Hebrews or Romans 9, and some of the discussion there? So we want to, when Christ comes on the scene, certainly there's this reevaluation of what are the inspired New Testament authors understanding about the Bibles that they've got on their shelf. That's the challenge that we have in biblical interpretation. And I mean, I'm saying this broad stroke, but the spiritual hermeneutic sometimes when I read it sounds like we just throw everything away of the Old Testament. It's just all fulfilled in Christ in the New. I think you have to do a little more work to get to the end. I mean, it gets to the same end, I think, but I have to say, because of what I'm reading in the Old Testament, not to the exclusion of Israel, we say as an ethnic, national, and territorial entity. It just doesn't get merged in. I think there's enough going on in the Old Testament to suggest God has clear intentions for the ethnic preservation, the national preservation, and then the nations are coming. They're the ones that are invited to go up, Not one nation merged together, but a kingdom or a nation of nations. A nation of nations is what I think. That's the difference, the picture there, I think. So, all right, well, let's move on. No, you can't ask a question. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask, what are alternative views of this replacement? Instead of replacement, I think of like a graph, like Romans 9, not all Jews are Jews, and understanding that from Abraham, God had chosen a person, not a nation yet, but a person. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And through this person, this individual, a whole nation, whole family was born. And we see this again in Christ. He chose one person. So, and there's a spiritual birth. So you try this physical image, and it produces a spiritual image that opens itself up to the Gentiles, as if something was put inside the other, like grafted.
Well, the grafting ideas.
Right, so
it's helpful.
You can't graft if you don't have something to graft into, right? So he had to have chose something.
What is it? There's the question between some of the differences. Yeah, what is it that I'm being grafted in?
It's like dropping a bucket inside of a bucket.
Is it a vine that's been rejected?
No. I was going to bring up Isaiah 11. If you look, it says that he's going to, and we talked about it class.
The sprout. The stump?
From the root, right? The tree's been cut down.
But it's still living.
No. If you look at
it's still living.
It's like a little heart there.
Where does it come from?
Huh?
And look at how grafts work. Have you ever grafted a tree?
Okay. The technicality of grafting, yes.
Yeah.
Look, that's good.
You're not a botanist. I was just curious because
I'm not a botanist. I'm an Old Testament scholar.
You don't have to be, but you think of when that metaphor was given for simile to these people, they understand. They're doing this all the time.
Yeah. Don't disagree.
It says that the tree's been cut down, and from the root something grows and it gives branches and bears fruit. So it's not that original entity that is producing fruit anymore. The thing was cut down and it made something grow out of the roots.
So we're being grafted into this little guy down the road, right? New Testament.
Whatever's been cut off, we're grafted into that.
Yeah.
From the roots.
Well, let's see. I know. Yeah. That's good. It's challenging.
Out of what it was.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. The question I'd have to kind of ask myself is this critter fully dead? Because there's roots. And you all know there's certain trees, getting back to your botany illustration, there's certain trees that even though you cut the thing down, there's still things growing. It's not dead.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Say, whatever the original intent of that tree was, it didn't produce fruit or whatever, and so it was cut down.
Yes.
But from that, still that same entity, something new was that was normally you don't let these little suckers grow off, right?
Yeah.
You trim those off so you get this main thing.
Yeah.
So all that was suppressed until the time that the tree was cut, and then it was allowed to grow.
Here's what I'm thinking. I have to do a little more thinking about it.
It's like a complete replacement.
Yeah. I wonder if I have to go back and think about it when I'm looking at and pulling together some of these texts. But when we talk about Israel, and Judah, the exilic experience, what happens to a nation who loses her king, her land, and her temple? The idea of being killed.
Sure.
We talked about that as the ancient idea of killing a king. So what does it mean to be a nation that's died? And you got your Ezekiel restoration, them dry bones idea coming in. That the new restoration means life. To who? To unified Israel.
That's us too, though.
But we're grafted into that.
Right.
So, yeah. So, are we being grafted in then to an entity that has its roots that go way back, or is it something brand new that's just a seed that hit the top of the trunk that grew on its own? There's a difference. Yeah. Maybe that's the difference. I don't know if that's in any of the literature that's out there. Those who discuss this conversation who have rocket science degrees. I mean, this gets into some real nuanced discussion.
I just wonder because you see, of course, we know that there are Jews, Israelis coming to faith in Christ and recognize
the modern phenomena. Yeah.
Like saved through grace. Okay, and we know that's going to be in Revelations. Every tongue, tribe, nation is going to be there. Okay, and we know that we get to heaven the same way. It doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile. Okay, so the question is though about the political state of Israel. Why so many of our church members support a nation state of Israel and not seeing that the land's maybe in reality a spiritual heaven. That's the land that we're given,
or a heaven that's coming,
and not a political state because. If you look at the history of the Israeli state, they've persecuted, even to this day, Christians. I mean, there's heavy restrictions on Christianity there, and you can't share Christianity with anyone less than 18 years of age. Any religious talk, you can be kicked out of the country.
Wow.
Yeah. Christian cities.
Okay.
How do we support that political entity when it's against...
that gets complicated. Yeah.
Was it a root or a shoot?
Root or shoot?
It's a good book title.
You need a book written on that. That ought to be your doctoral dissertation. Root or shoot? Root or shoot? Shoot. Did I spell that right? Yeah, shot, not shot, shoot. Okay, we need to move on. I want to get to the end here. So, all right, so we move on. We've got this genealogy and chapter 9, a little bit of the genealogy in chapter 9, interestingly, intersects directly with Nehemiah, the other history book, chapter 11, verses 1 through 24. So in both of these contexts, so Chronicles 9, we have Nehemiah chapter 11, are going to focus on the Levites, the temple workers, the priests, the Levitical priests, those who were in Jerusalem. In other words, it's a way of legitimizing those who are going to be involved in the temple work, which is an interesting concern. We know that was Nehemiah's concern as well as Ezra's concern, right? Everybody coming back, not everybody's legitimate to go and work in the temple. You have to be genetically genealogically linked to the right household name, right? So that was an interesting similarity and focus. So the chronicler brings that emphasis in as well. Yeah, so now we move to this picture is worth 1,000 words, but what does it feel like to be excluded, right? That's my point here. Chapter 10, beginning in chapter 10, we're going to talk about the exclusion. Not so much like this picture, but what we see now, beginning in the author of Chronicles, is a continuation of his theological agenda, right? I called it the eschatological anticipation agenda. And now we focus on the reigns of David and Solomon. So what's interesting now in the text, if you ever want to study this, there's some great books that have been written on it. We see and it's not a bad thing, but we talk about authorial intent or bias, theological motivation for writing. So we talk about selectivity. The author is intended, or we have to give the author permission to choose to include some things and exclude, like the picture, other things. So for example, here it shows up right away in chapter 10. This is a Trivial Pursuit question. Austin, I hope you get this right. Your final grade might be determined on how you answer this question. How many chapters does the historian, the author of Samuel, give to King Saul? Without looking at your notes. Can anybody answer? No. Saul gets chapters 1 Samuel 9 through 31. Saul. 22 chapters. That's a lot. How many chapters does the chronicler give to Saul? 1. Basically 1.5 if you argue the genealogy there. But 1 chapter, chapter 10. And then notice what the chronicler does. Chapter 11 immediately focuses on our hero, King David. David becomes king. So that's interesting. That's intentional. That's an example of the authorial bias of the author. So the theological agenda, again, shows up in what the author is choosing to exclude, the silence part. We have another exclusion picture here that's kind of cute. So why is he leaving Saul out of his history? Well, we have to ask him, of course, but we can kind of come close to maybe understanding his agenda. What's interesting is in his account of Saul, he immediately jumps to 1 Samuel chapter 31 and the focus on the death narrative of Saul. Well, that's happy. What a happy ending that is, right? And not only Saul, but his sons. It jumps right to what was recorded previously by the historian. We call him the historian, the author of Samuel. So the author of Chronicles, the chronicler, is just jumping in right there to chapter 31. And then right at the end in chapter 10, all the way up to verse 12, we have pretty much verbatim, word for word, but then a shocking last 2 verses, verse 13 and 14, which come directly out of the mouth of the chronicler that are not found in the account in Samuel. So let's read verse 13 and 14. So after he basically copies and pastes all of 1 Samuel 31, here's what the chronicler says. So Saul died for his trespass which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord which he did not keep, and also because he asked counsel of a medium, making an inquiry of it, and did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he, capital H, killed him, and turned the kingdom of David to the son, turned the kingdom to David, the son of Jesse. That sounds kind of shocking. God's killing? Uh-oh. Now we have to bring Richard Dawkins into the conversation. It's another one of those passages that the mean radical atheists like to poke at and dangle over our little heads. What's really going on here? The author here is giving us a real crystal clear theological assessment. And here's what I think is going on here. We have to be careful about the word kill, first of all. Let's remind ourselves of the ancient Near Eastern idea of what it means to kill a king. See, in the ancient world, a king could still be physically alive, but be dead with regards to his throne that's been removed from him. his kingdom has been taken away and he's been banished or exiled. So that's when a king dies, technically. So what's interesting, if we go back to 1 Samuel, our good friend, by the way, remember? 1 Samuel 15. We spent a lot of time talking about 1 Samuel 15 earlier this semester. Let's take a look and remind ourselves of the author there and what the assessment is from the historian. First, starting in chapter 15, starting in verse 26. There we go. But Samuel says to Saul, I'll not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord. There's similarity there, right, with the author of Chronicles, right? You see it? And the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And as Samuel turned to go, Saul seized the edge of his robe and he tore it. And Samuel says, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. So I'd argue that the author of Chronicles is basically giving a commentary back to 1 Samuel 15. This is when Saul died as king. It's when the Lord rejected him as king and tore the kingdom from him, which eventually is going to happen, of course. But the decision was here. So I think the author of Chronicles is giving us a commentary very quickly. He doesn't have to go into much detail at all. He says, look, if you want to read the full version, go back and read it, 22 chapters. I'm just telling you the big idea with Saul. So the Lord rejected him. And that's the idea of the language of being killed. So that's the divine vantage point. So the chronicler quickly moves from that king who the Lord rejected to David, who the Lord accepted fully. Warts and all, by the way. All right. And I think that fits better with the let him go up theological agenda that the author of Chronicles has. It's not a history book about kings who the Lord rejected. Let's not waste our time with that. We want to quickly get to the kings who the Lord accepted and has built his foundation of the future on, and that's King David, extended to King Solomon and some of the other kings down the road. All right, let's move on. So here's, I've given you some details in the speaker notes about with regards to his focus on King David, and we see this same theological agenda come through with the chronicler, what he chooses to say and not say about King David. So for example, the chronicler doesn't even mention any of Saul's attempts to kill King David, except for a very brief reference there in 1 Chronicles chapter 12. Second, the chronicle passes over the entire civil war that took place in the early days of King David. Remember the conflict between those still loyal to King Saul and when David was overseeing the southern province of Judah in 2 Samuel chapters 2 through 4, not included at all in the chronicler. Third, in Chronicles we see an emphasis on the all Israel, and you see that in chapter 11 verse 1. So if you remember, the all Israel coming to make David king didn't happen. First, because Ishbosheth brought about the political civil war. And after the civil war, it wasn't until after South versus North that you had all Israel coming in to name David king. Not until after. So that's interesting. And then there's no mention of, if we turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 20, that's a specific, very memorable example. You know, in those days when all good kings went out to war, Joab led the army and ravaged the land of the sons of Ammon. He came to and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem, and Joab struck Rabbah and overthrew it. And what happens next? According to the author of Samuel, there's the whole thing with Bathsheba, and it's not there in Chronicles chapter 20, verse 1 and following. He leaves off the whole adultery with Bathsheba as well as the cover-up murder of Uriah. It's not there. That's interesting. And then there's no mention of the civil war. Chapters in 2 Samuel, chapters 11 through chapter 20, all of that inner drama amongst David's sons and all of the conflict and all of that, it's not even found in Chronicles. All right, So what does the chronicler choose to include? So if he's excluded those things, you see his agenda shine forth. He's not wanting to regurgitate the warts part of the warts and all of King David. He wants to focus on the things that really matter. So David becoming king at Hebron, 1 Chronicles chapter 11. David's victory over the Jebusites. The establishment of Jerusalem as the capital city in verses 4 through 9. Chapters 13 through 16, the focus of David's return of the ark, right, back to Jerusalem. I'm going to include that. And center focus is 1 Chronicles 17, the Davidic covenant and the promise of the everlasting kingdom. David's victory over his enemies, chapters 18 through 20. And then all of the details, interestingly, as we'll see, that are not even mentioned in Samuel. David's involvement in the, you might say, the pre-work leading up to the building of the temple. The author of Chronicles chooses to include those details. Not that David built the temple, but David was involved in the foundational work of the organization leading up to Solomon's work to build the temple. So David's inclusion there is kind of interesting. All right. So that's the theological agenda of the chronicler moving ahead. So in chapters 13 through 16, David returns the ark. What's interesting, let's just focus a little bit on that. The chronicler in chapter 15, beginning in verse 16 and down through verse 22, let's just spend a little time there. This is information that we have that's giving extra emphasis. So in chapter 15, 1 Chronicles 15, verse 16, David spoke to the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their relatives, the singers, with instruments of music, harps, lyres, loud-sounding cymbals, to raise sounds of joy. So there's this organization of those who were involved in the centrality of worship, which is interesting for those of you in music ministry, all the way down to, there it is, in verse 25. So all of those details, and then he says in verse 25, so it was with David, with the elders of Israel and the captains over thousands who went up to bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the house of Obed. And you see David's involvement there. And in fact, David's the one who lays the theological foundation for how the musical, you might say, the musical side of things was set up, with how worship was to take place in the temple. David had a hand in that, and that's brought into the discussion here with the chronicler. And if you remember, we won't look there, but in Nehemiah chapter 12, beginning in verse 44, that was also an emphasis of Nehemiah. As he's seeing the temple rebuilt, he says, how are we going to have worship in this place? And he says, I remember the way David and Solomon set things up. We're going to model our worship enterprise just like they did. So that's what we see in Nehemiah chapter 12. So let's see. And if we look at chapter 16, what's interesting is there we have this psalm of thanksgiving. Do you see that begins there in verse 8? And you see in verse 7, the author sets this up. On that day, David first assigned Asaph and his relatives to give thanks to the Lord. And then he says, here's the psalm that was written to commemorate this occasion. And what's interesting, what we see there is a little bit difficult to explain, but you see the psalm there from verse 8 in chapter 16 all the way over to verse 36. It's an entire psalm. And we don't see the whole thing in its entirety in the book of Psalms. What this is you might call it a collage. It's a collection of portions of Psalm 105, Psalm 96, and Psalm 106. 3 portions of Psalms woven together by the author of Chronicles. All of these Psalms were attributed to King David, but brought back in a theologically significant way. So for the chronicler, King David is definitely at the center of God's future plan for his people. And these Psalms, while they're attributed to King David, also come with a focus on themselves, the greatness of the Lord and the salvation of his people. So it's interesting that the chronicler is reading his Old Testament and thinking of a way of bringing David into the center of the activity for his audience. What has David said about our future, right? Well, let's go find it. Psalm 105, Psalm 96, Psalm 106. Bring it together. Focus on the Lord, who's victorious in the salvation of his people. That's our future, you see. You see how it works. So the chronicler is very active as a theologian. But, as a leaping off point, what's important for our people who are discouraged, who have a loss of hope? And, worship is something that is important and should be central in our pastoral strategy to bring hope of encouragement to a group of people who are questioning and maybe wondering what's next and who are downcast. And, worship is our way to bring them in and remind them of what God's plan for their salvation and plan for their future and hope is. So we have to remind ourselves that worship like this, as it was an encouragement then, has a tend to focus us off of ourselves, off of our situation, and onto what God's agenda is. That was the whole theologically driven point of the chronicler. He's trying to remind people God's not through with us. He has a future and a hope. Things are the way they are now, but things are going to get better right down the road. So that's important. Now, I want to get to this. Now we get to the center of the Davidic covenant, which is in 1 Chronicles chapter 17. Now, this is interesting. This is kind of some of my own observations again. So again, I don't want to break a church up over this. There's no controversy here. It's merely this guy, this biblical scholar, trying to make sense of a historically hard to interpret verse. If you read verse 17, right there, the parallel verse is 1 Samuel 7:19. So here again, the chronicler is at work, comparing and recasting. And what's interesting is now, not so much what was omitted, but what was included, and seemingly different emphasis is brought in. All right? Now, these are divine inspired words, you might say, kind of an amplification of what might be going on in the earlier text. So the New American Standard, the way the committee of the New American Standard translation went with this text, and mind you, this text, if you do the research, it's all over the place in terms of translation. It's really interesting. You may have a different translation in your New International Version or the CSV or whatever. Okay, so, and this was a small thing in thine eyes, O God, but thou hast spoken of thy servant's house for a great while to come, and hast regarded me according to the standard of a man of high degree, O Lord God. So what the New American Standard translators is doing, part of this gets into even some arguments that come out of the transmission of the text, some textual discussions as well. So it's multifaceted in terms of its complexity. So it's not an easy puzzle to solve. But the language, you see, the language of sight and has regarded me or seen me, that's the Hebrew idea of sight or seen me, in the translation here focuses on David. So the Lord is seeing David as a standard of a man of high degree. Y'all see that? See, this is coming from David's reflection on the Nathan oracle that's just been delivered to him. So David's having a quiet time moment saying, what's just happened? Lord, you've seen me according to the standard of a man of high degree. So there the focus is on David in his self-reflection. Now what I've done is kind of looked at the text in Hebrew and come up with a slightly different translation. This is my humble attempt. I think it does a better job of fitting into the overall theological agenda of the chronicler. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to regard that the object of divine sight, what is it that the Lord sees or confirms, which is in the meaning of the word for sight or the idea of sight, is David as literally the Hebrew says Torah of humanity. It's the word Torah only in a feminine construct, but it's the Torah of humanity. And then there's this standalone word that drives the interpreters crazy and what to do with. Instead of the high degree idea of the New American Standard, I'm just going to go with the nominal form of the verbal idea to basically, guess what? To go up. So if you look in your Hebrew Bible and you see the idea of ascent in the Psalms of Ascent, that idea, that noun idea, ascent or step is what that is. The Psalms of step or ascent. It's the word that's found here. Mahala. It's the noun form of the idea of to go up, which is the chronicler's last word of the Hebrew Bible. It's this verbal idea moved into the noun form, and I think it's put here as I would say, although this is all over the place in the scholarly world, it's the chronicler trying to bring into the Davidic covenant text his very last word of the Hebrew canon, let him go up. It's the ascent. It's the Torah of humanity, a.k.a. the ascent, O Lord God. It's the stepping stone. So the Davidic covenant, Lord, this is David speaking here, that you've just issued to me, David speaking through the prophet Nathan, it's the very stepping stone. It's the ascent to the invitation, let him go up. We're walking up. We're stepping on top of something. The idea is it's the promises of the Davidic covenant. It's those unconditional, everlasting promises that I'm encouraging my audience with to let them go up. Stepping stones are the foundation blocks of the Davidic covenant. So I know that gets complicated. It's not going to be on your final exams, so don't worry. So we go up to Zion. Our ascent is to the New Jerusalem to meet this coming Davidic king, one from the seed, the everlasting promise that was promised to the seed of David. So that's the eschatological encouragement that I see going on here. All right, that was complicated. Now let's move on to some easier things. So really after the Davidic covenant, we're going to move on to the rest of 1 Chronicles, which is going to focus on David's preparation for the building of the temple. So this is chapter 18 through 29. And we won't turn there, but you remember the prophet Haggai, who's one of those post-exilic prophets. And in chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, we remember the prophet Haggai encouraging, right, the temple rebuilders not to give up, not to be discouraged, because you remember he says that the latter glory of this temple will be greater than the former glory. In other words, some of the people around would have remembered Solomon's temple, having come back and said, wow, look at this temple. Well, it's nothing like Solomon's temple. And everybody's like, oh, oy vey, Debbie Downer. Those are all idioms meaning, gloom, despair, and agony on me. I cannot, how else can I say it? But no. Haggai says it's not about this temple, it's about the temple that's coming. So when that temple comes, it's going to be greater than the one that we have here. So what's interesting is that, you have the same kind of eschatological encouragement. And let's take a look at 1 Chronicles chapter 22.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
There is no 1 Samuel 7:19.
We'll check the scripture for Samuel.
2 Samuel.
Okay, 7.
Did I make a mistake on that slide?
You wrote for Samuel.
Oh, man. I get an F for today. What did I do? Oh, 1 Samuel. Oh, 2 Samuel. Sorry. I'll change that. Note to self. Okay, everybody, 2 Samuel 7:19. All right. So what we have going on here is this. By focusing on David, what we have here is the chronicler, bringing encouragement to the future plan for the temple. 22 verse 6, 1 Chronicles 22 verse 6. Solomon is going to be charged by David, his son. And by the way, none of these chapters are found in Samuel. This is unique material. Then he called for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord, God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, my son, I have intended to build a house to the name of the Lord, but the word of the Lord has come to me, saying, you have shed much blood, and, well, I guess this is actually a parallel account, and have waged wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood on the earth before me. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all of his enemies on every side. For his name shall be Solomon, and I'll give peace and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name. So there's this transfer of the baton, and really there's some text beyond this, starting in chapter 23-ish, that become unique for the chronicler. And none of these texts are found in First Samuel. All right, let's move on. David's going to assemble all Israel, and he's going to charge them with regards to the temple in chapter 28. Let's take a look there, beginning in verse 1. Now David assembled at Jerusalem all the officials of Israel, the princes of the tribes, and the commanders of the divisions that served the king, and commanders of thousands, and the commanders of hundreds, and the overseers, and all the livestock belonging to the king's sons, those who were overseeing it, with even the officials and the mighty men, even all of the valiant men. And then down to verse 8. So now, in the sight of all Israel, there's the emphasis, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, observe and seek after all the commandments of the Lord your God, in order that you may possess the good land and bequeath it to your sons after you forever. As for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father, and serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind. For the Lord your God searches hearts and understands every intent of his thoughts. If you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. Whew, that sounds kind of harsh there. But what's interesting, I think, for the chronicler, this chapter and this particular charge is unique information that's brought in from the chronicler to the audience. His audience, remember, are the post-exilic group. His words to Solomon, I think, are also God's words to the people who've come back. You know, this strong language is intended for the exilic community, the post-exilic community that's come back, the faithful remnant, right? Remember all of the concerns from Ezra and Nehemiah? No intermarrying. Let's not let our guard down with regards to the potential risk of syncretism. We cannot go down that path again. So it's this strong language intended to remind this group not to repeat the same kinds of mistakes, I think. All right, then we quickly turn to chapter 29 and verse 28. What's also interesting about this is we see some evidence of some of the additional source material that the author of Chronicles may have used to bring in some of this extra special emphasis that wasn't found in Samuel. So in verse 28, then he died, that is David, in a ripe old age, full of days, riches and honor, and his son Solomon reigned in his place. Now the acts of King David, from first to last, are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, that is the idea of Samuel being a prophet, in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer, with all his reign, his power, and the circumstances which came on him, on Israel, and in all the kingdoms of the land. So you've got the chronicler who's obviously pulling from his source material Samuel Kings, but he's reading or seeing, or he's influenced also by sources coming from active prophets. It seems like they were writing prophets as well, but unfortunately their material didn't make it into the canon. Samuel the seer, the prophet, we know him. Nathan, the one, Nathan's oracle to King David. Also Gad the seer. So these are also active prophets in that day, hearing from God and being involved in influencing. So whether or not they're active prophets, they seem to be writing prophets. That's part of the scholarly conversation. So then we move into 2 Chronicles. In chapter 1 through chapter 9, verse 31, and 2 Chronicles is really word for word coming from the parallel text from Kings, from 1 Kings. But interestingly, like what we saw with King David, the theological agenda of the chronicler comes through with what is omitted in the historical account of the chronicler with regards to details regarding King Solomon. So the chronicler says nothing about Solomon's marriages and his foreign wives. Remember how much of a problem that was for the author of Kings. The author of Chronicles says nothing about Solomon's turning to false gods at the end of his life because of the influence, which led to the divided kingdom, by the way, in 1 Kings chapter 11. None of that's referred to in Chronicles. And nothing about Solomon's reference to building his own palace. So it's interesting. We see another little clue here in chapter 1. And in chapter 1, let's see here. Chapter 1, there we go. So you see what's going on here in chapter 1 and beginning in verse 14. So this is a parallel account to 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 26 and 29. And the reference here is to all of the wealth of Solomon. Do you remember we talked about this when we were looking at 1 Kings? Solomon amassed an army. You see all the details there with regards to the amassing of horsemen and chariots. That's the building of an army. You see the reference there to the multiplication in verse 15 of gold and silver, Solomon's horses and his chariots, and all of that building of great wealth. Do you remember with regards to the author of Kings and the idea of placement? So notice what happens next after the chronicler accounts for his great wealth. The next thing that happens is the building of the temple. So, according to the author of Chronicles, he's putting emphasis on Solomon's use of those resources in the right way with regards to the application of his wisdom and the application of those resources on the building of the temple. But you remember in Kings, the author of Kings, what happens after this assessment of his wealth, according to the author of Kings, is placed after the completion of the temple. His assessment comes after the completion of the temple. So for the author of Kings, Solomon's accumulation of wealth is kind of a way of him theologically explaining the problems that happen leading to the divided kingdom. You've got a divided heart of this king. He's violated the prescriptions coming from Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. He's amassed gold. He's amassed an army. He's multiplied wives and women, all in violation of Moses' instructions. So this is leading us to the divided kingdom. So you see the theological agendas coming through as you compare and contrast the author of Kings to the author of Chronicles. All right, so that's just another little clue there. So we move on in 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 1, all the way to the end, chapter 36, verse 23, is now, these chapters are going to cover the time of the monarchy after Solomon, all the way up through the exile and into the restoration. But what's interesting is, in Chronicles, the difference is, in Kings you have a lot of emphasis on the northern kingdom and its failures, bad king after bad king after bad king. In Chronicles, there's really a de-emphasis on the northern kingdom. All of the attention seems more focused on the southern kingdom, and more specifically, some of the reforming kings, such as Hezekiah and Josiah. They'll take the largest portion of the coverage. You know, the author of Chronicles is not going to talk about, 1 Kings chapter 11, where we were told that Solomon is told that the kingdom would be divided over his sins. All of that is excluded according to the chronicler. The chronicler is wanting the focus of history to be on nothing that divides, but everything that unites. And God's future plan to bring about restoration, right, to the divided kingdom and to the exiles, bringing them back. And so the chronicler wants to encourage his audience with this idea of a unified nation, a restored nation, which is God's plan A for Israel's future. All right? So, like I said, of particular interest is the chronicler's interest on the reforming kings, Hezekiah and Josiah. And the reforming efforts of each of these kings is of particular interest to the chronicler, because reform is a good thing, especially when you have sin in the community. We need to remind ourselves, how are we to respond to these kinds of situations? So reform is a good thing, especially as it relates to the temple. All right? And Kings is, the author of Kings really doesn't say anything about the corruption that occurred during the time with regards to temple worship. The author of Chronicles is going to bring more emphasis on what happens with regards to the defilement of the temple. So, for example, we see this emphasis if we turn over to 2 Chronicles, chapter 29, beginning in verse 12. Chapter 29, verse 12. So these are reforms more directed at the reform efforts that go on with regards to the temple. Then the Levites arose, and let's see. All of them are listed, and they assembled, verse 15, their brothers. They consecrated themselves and went in to cleanse the house of the Lord, according to the commandment of the king, by the words of the Lord. And this is, one of the reform efforts of King Hezekiah. These details are not given in the earlier king's account. So the priests went into the inner part of the house of the Lord to cleanse it, and every unclean thing which they found in the temple of the Lord they brought out to the court of the house of the Lord. Then the Levites received it to carry it out to the Kidron Valley for proper burial and disposal, right? So this is some of the things that we see. So there's emphasis on verse 16 down through verse 19. We see the details given to the Levitical priests and how they're organized to bring about this reform. And let's see, in verses 25, let's look at that. So then he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with harps, and with lyres, according to the command of David, and of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet. And the command was from the Lord through his prophets, which you see the names that we saw back when we were talking about the possible additional source materials from these active prophets. Might be a connection there. I'd have to look it up in the scholarly conversation. And the Levites stood with the musical instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah gave the order to offer the burnt offering on the altar, and so on and so forth. So you see that here, the organization of the Levitical priests who were serving as the musicians to lead worship during this time of this offering, according to the words of Nathan and of David, just like they did it. And that's what we see the emphasis here. We saw that same emphasis back in 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 14. And then after this temple cleansing, we see Hezekiah focus on a restitution of the Passover in chapter 30, verses 1 through 3. And you see there the reinstitution of the Passover as central to the faith community. So Hezekiah's reforms were going to bring about a restoration of joy to Jerusalem. In chapter 30, over in verse 25, let's have Joe up here. Could you read that for us? 25 through 27.
The whole assembly of Judah, and the priests and the Levites, and the whole assembly that came out of Israel, and the sojourners who came out of the land of Israel, and the sojourners who lived in Judah rejoiced. So there was a great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. Then the priests and the Levites arose and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer came to his holy habitation in heaven.
yeah, anything that the chronicler could do to link the present situation as a way of encouragement to the glory days, right, of King David and King Solomon is what he's doing. What they did back then, before things got really bad and we all went into exile, is what we got to go back to and figure out a way to do it again. So some of those old-time, well, okay, I don't want to get distracted. I was distracting myself. So Sennacherib finds some airplay, and if we turn over to chapter 32, remember we talked a lot about the Sennacherib crisis back when we looked at King Hezekiah. So Hezekiah's, the Sennacherib crisis is abbreviated. It's not such a big deal for the author of Chronicles in chapter 32, but more emphasis is put by the chronicler in the fact that Yahweh answers the prayer of Hezekiah. And we see that emphasis given in chapter 32 over in beginning in verse 20. On the prayer, the fact that God's sovereign and he's going to answer the prayer for all of us. But King Hezekiah and Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, prayed about this and cried out to heaven. And the Lord sent an angel who destroyed every mighty warrior, commander, and officer in the camp of the king of Assyria. So he returned in shame to his own land. And when he entered the temple of his God, some of his own children killed him there with a sword. So we remember reading that from 2 Kings. So the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and from the hand of all the others, and guided them on every side. Something that you'd want to know when you are back being the little guy in a world that's mean and can rise up against you, right? God answers the prayer of those in leadership. And in chapter 34, we move over to reform efforts of King Josiah. And regarding King Josiah, in chapter 34, we see a similar emphasis that is brought in with regards to King Josiah and his involvement with reform efforts. So we see, again repeated, the chronicler gives the details with regards to King Josiah's discovery of the book of the Torah, King Josiah's focus on the covenant renewal, the Passover celebration, and Josiah's tragic death at Megiddo. There's an interesting change that takes place with regards to the chronicler. It's subtle, it's not a big deal, but for the chronicler, the reform efforts for King Josiah happen before the discovery of the book of the Torah, not after. For the author of Kings, who's writing about the reform efforts, he puts emphasis on the fact that the reform efforts happen as a result of the discovery of the book of the Torah in the temple. And we see the details there in chapter 34, verses 8 through 18. So the historian, the author of Kings, makes the discovery of the lost book as the first or causal instrument to Josiah's reforms. It's interesting that the author of Chronicles seems to put a greater emphasis on the community at work to bring about the reform efforts. So that was a dramatic point I just made, and a lot of you are looking like you're falling asleep. So let me finish really quickly. Sorry, big finish, push to the end. So finally, the chronicler records his history of the exile and the restoration. And we see that in the final chapter, verse 36. According to the chronicler, the exile and the return is clearly explained by the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy that the exile would last approximately 70 years. And we see that in the details of chapter 36, verse 21. Let's see, is that what I want to read? No, verse 21. But Necho sent messengers to him, saying, "What have we to do with each other, O king of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war, and God has ordered me to hurry." Let's see. What, I missed something. Stop for your own sake. No, where's the reference to King Jeremiah? Oh, okay. Well, let's see. I misreferenced something. I'm having a hard time finding it. Somewhere in here, help me out. According to Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years, where does it show up? I'll give an automatic A to the first person that finds it. That'll wake you up. Okay. Verse 20. Well, that's what I was reading. According to the... It's just been...
35. It's 36:21.
Oh, I was reading 35. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Verse 21. Yes, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Goodness gracious, until the land has enjoyed its Sabbaths, all the days of its desolation, it kept Sabbath until 70 years. War complete. Yes, emphasis by the chronicler. So, the precipitating event, interestingly, Cyrus's decree, as we've pointed out time and time again, comes as the very end, the emphatic ending of the Hebrew canon, the very last book of the Hebrew canon, but it's cut in half at the very words, let him go up. So I think very intentionally, the Cyrus decree is not the end. It really marks the beginning. It marks, in a kind of an interesting way, is a signal to invite eschatologically and encourage the faithful remnant that God's future is still an open-ended book. An open-ended book. I just came up with that just now. Open-ended book. And thankfully, that's our history too. We read the last word of the Hebrew canon as an open book invitation, that God's let him go up invitation should be ringing in our ears as well. So there you go. So we finished early at the symbolic ringing of the train whistle. That definitely marks the end of the semester. I really thank you, all of you, for your encouragement over the semester. Let me remind you of some housekeeping things. So we've got a final exam. The details of the final exam are posted. I've given you kind of a heads up on preparation. Don't forget that in the very first slide today, to focus in on those center of gravity moments. That'll help you with your essay preparation. There's a post-test. It's also in the announcement. You can practice that. That'll only contribute positively to your final grade as an extra credit. So pre-test, post-test, combination. Don't worry about that and get stressed. Just do it and do your best. Don't even have to, and that's to help our accreditation process. There are extra credit opportunities in the extra credit tab. I think there's 4 of them now, and they're all there to if you've got some free time, you can take one of those out for a test drive and get that done. And so any other questions? Yeah.
If y'all see a 0 in a place on the discussion board, but you've done 10, just know that you finished your 10. I'm putting zeros in.
That's for your housekeeping.
Yeah, that's just for me.
As a place marker. Yeah.
Don't get scared if you see a 0 if you finished your 10.
There'll be one more discussion forum question this week, but it'll help you in preparation for your final exam. It won't be extra unnecessary busy work. So that way your discussion group can benefit from kind of a little study group on some of these center of gravity issues. So it'll be helpful for your group. So please avail yourself of that opportunity to not only help yourself in the discussion question, but help some of your colleagues who might benefit from some of your insights. All right? So all focus now on the finish line. We have our battle orders. Thanks very much for a great semester. I always appreciate, thank you. I should have brought food. Man, I forgot. The SRT, Student Rating of Teaching, is something you can do after the dust settles from the semester, but I do read those words and comments from my students, and I'm always looking for ways to improve the experience for the next group of students. So if you have some time, please take advantage of that as well. So, all right. Thank you very much.